The last thing Riccardo Falcone saw of his empire was the name. His name, carved in polished obsidian, 10 feet tall, above the grand entrance of Falcone Tower. Now, 2 workmen on a scaffold were carefully unbolting the letter F. A woman stood on the marble steps below, her arms crossed, watching the desecration. She wore a simple grey dress that did nothing to soften the hard, unforgiving line of her jaw. Falcone, flanked by 2 stone-faced federal agents, felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated hatred shake his bones. "You," he rasped, the word a shard of glass in his throat. "You're the waitress." Ava Riley didn't flinch. She simply offered him a small, tight smile that held no warmth at all. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey after a long and patient hunt. The workman pried the F loose. It swung for a moment on its safety cable, a monument to his fallen power, before they guided it down. "Not anymore," she said, her voice clear and steady in the morning air. 6 months earlier, the only thing Ava was hunting for was a clean fork. The Gilded Spoon Diner was a relic, a pocket of worn-out warmth in a neighborhood rapidly being devoured by steel and glass. It was honest work. It was also the only job that let her live above the shop, just a flight of stairs away from her mother. The bell above the door chimed, announcing an arrival that soured the air like curdled milk. Riccardo Falcone slid into the corner booth, his 2 oversized thugs, Rocco and Sal, squeezing in on either side. He didn't look at the menu. He never did. He just snapped his fingers, a sound like a breaking bone. Ava approached, her notepad in hand. "The usual, Mr. Falcone?" He scanned her face, his eyes lingering for a moment on the faint lines of exhaustion around hers. "You look tired, sweetheart. Tough life." He said it not with sympathy, but with a kind of gloating curiosity, the way a scientist might observe a struggling insect. "Just coffee," she said, her voice flat. She brought the pot over, her movements practiced and efficient. As she poured, he shifted his leg, knocking the table. Hot coffee sloshed over the side of the cup, splashing across the back of her hand. A sharp, biting pain flared up her arm. She hissed, pulling her hand back, but her face remained a mask of professional calm. Falcone didn't even pretend it was an accident. He just watched her, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Clumsy," he commented. Rocco and Sal chuckled like trained dogs. Ava gritted her teeth, placed the pot on the table and turned to leave. "Hey," his voice stopped her. "What's that piece of junk around your neck?" Her hand instinctively went to the small silver locket. It was worn smooth with time, its surface dented and scratched. "It was my father's," she said, the words tight in her throat. Inside was a tiny, faded picture of him, the only one she had left. Falcone squinted at it. "My tailor wouldn't use that to hold up his pants. You should get some self-respect." The insult landed like a physical blow. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her. Old Mr. Henderson from the bakery, the 2 nurses from the clinic down the street. They were all silent, all intimidated. She wanted to scream, to throw the scalding coffee in his smug face. But she couldn't. Not here. Not now. She returned later with the bill. He tossed a platinum credit card onto the table. When she came back with the slip, he scribbled a signature and pushed it toward her. There was no tip. Instead, he pulled a single, crumpled dollar bill from his pocket and dropped it on the floor between his polished Italian shoes. "For the entertainment," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Ava stared at the crumpled bill on the grimy linoleum. It was a calculated act of humiliation. He wanted her to bend down, to grovel at his feet for a single dollar. She could feel her blood turning to ice. Slowly, deliberately. She met his gaze. Then she looked down at the dollar and back at him. She didn't move. Falcone's smirk widened. He lifted his foot and ground the bill into the floor, twisting his heel until the paper was a shredded, dirty mess. "On second thought," he said, standing up and smoothing his suit jacket, "the service wasn't worth it." He and his men walked out, leaving a wake of silence behind them. Ava stood perfectly still, her burned hand throbbing, her father's locket feeling cold against her skin. She wasn't looking at the ruined dollar. She was looking at the credit card he'd left on the table for a fraction of a second too long. In her mind, she saw it clearly. The 16-digit number, the expiration date, the 3 digits on the back. She saw the issuing bank, a subsidiary known for its lax international transfer protocols. He thought he was grinding a waitress under his heel. He had no idea he had just handed a weapon to a forensic accountant. Later that night, the scent of antiseptic and her mother's lavender tea filled their small apartment. Ava gently changed the dressing on her mother's IV line, her movements deft and sure. "Your hand," her mother, Eleanor, whispered, her voice thin and reedy. "What happened?" "Just a little spill at work, Mum," Ava lied, forcing a smile. "You know me, graceful as a baby elephant." Eleanor's eyes, though clouded with illness, were sharp. "It was him, wasn't it? The man who bought the building?" Ava didn't answer. She just finished her work, fluffed her mother's pillow, and made sure the oxygen machine was humming its steady, life-giving rhythm. Once Eleanor was asleep, Ava went to the small desk, crammed into the corner of the living room. She pushed aside a stack of medical bills and opened her laptop. The screen flickered to life, not with social media or streaming sites, but with a dense, intricate web of data. It was a digital ghost of Riccardo Falcone's empire. Shell corporations nested within other shell corporations, flowing through accounts in the Cayman Islands, Panama, and Cyprus. For 3 years, Ava had been one of the top forensic accountants at the Department of Justice, untangling the financial knots of the world's most dangerous criminals. She'd been a hunter, chasing ghosts through encrypted servers and shadowy ledgers. She'd quit it all when her mother's illness took a turn, trading a 6-figure salary for a minimum wage apron to be close to her. But a hunter never forgets how to track. She began her work. The credit card number Falcone had so carelessly displayed was her key. It wasn't about stealing money. That was crude, traceable. This was about finding a door. She used the card to make a tiny, legitimate online purchase, a $5 donation to a dog shelter, routed through a server in Estonia. It was a digital breadcrumb. As Falcone's bank processed the payment, its security protocols would communicate with the shelter's payment gateway. For a nanosecond, a digital handshake would occur. And in that nanosecond, a packet of data she'd piggybacked onto the transaction would burrow into Falcone's banking network. It was a whisper in a hurricane, a single drop of dye in an ocean. But it was enough. She watched the code execute. Access denied. Access denied. Then, a flicker of green text. Low-level portal accessed. Falcone Imports, LLC, subsidiary payroll account. It was a small, dusty storeroom in his digital fortress, but it was inside. A cold, determined smile touched Ava's lips for the first time that day. Falcone had humiliated a waitress. He had no idea he'd just invited a wolf into his fold. The game had begun. The official notice arrived a week later. A sterile, white envelope slid under every door in the building. It wasn't a request. It was a command. A 15-day eviction notice. The buyout offer was an insult, barely enough to cover a security deposit on a new apartment, let alone the moving costs for specialized medical equipment. Panic rippled through the old building. Mr. Henderson, his hands trembling, showed Ava his notice. "My family has run the bakery downstairs for 70 years, he said, his voice cracking. "Where do we go?" Ava tried to be the voice of reason. She organized a tenants' meeting, explaining their rights, the illegality of a 15-day notice for long-term residents. She drafted a letter to Falcone's property management company, citing city ordinances and state laws. The response was a phone call from a man who introduced himself as the property manager. He laughed. "Laws?" he'd sneered. "Sweetheart, Mr. Falcone makes the laws in this part of the city. You and your sick mother have 2 weeks. Be smart." The line went dead. That was the final warning. The strike came 2 nights later. At 2:17 a.m., the power went out. Not just a flicker, but a sudden, total plunge into darkness and silence. The comforting hum of Eleanor's oxygen concentrator died. In the suffocating quiet that followed, Ava heard her mother's breath catch, then begin to hitch in a ragged, desperate rhythm. "Ava?" Eleanor's voice was a thread of fear in the dark. "I'm here, Mum." Ava was already moving, her heart hammering against her ribs. She fumbled for the emergency oxygen tank, her hands shaking as she twisted the valve. The hiss of escaping oxygen was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She fitted the mask over her mother's face, her own breathing shallow with terror. The backup tank only had a few hours' worth of oxygen. She called the power company. They reported no outages in the area. She went to the basement, her phone's flashlight cutting a nervous beam through the darkness. The main breaker for their building had been deliberately thrown, and the heavy-duty lever was padlocked in the off position, with a thick, industrial lock she couldn't possibly break. It was a message, written in darkness and suffocating silence. "We can turn off your mother's life support whenever we want." For 6 hours, Ava sat by her mother's bed, one hand on the cool metal of the oxygen tank, the other holding her mother's frail hand. She watched the pressure gauge needle creep steadily toward 0. With every shallow breath her mother took, a cold, pure rage solidified in Ava's chest. It was no longer about a building or an insult. Falcone had reached into her home and put his hands on the only person she had left in the world. He had tried to use her mother's fragile life as a negotiating tool. This was the point of no return. He hadn't just crossed a line, he had burned the entire map. By the time the sun rose and she managed to get a handyman to cut the lock, something inside Ava had changed. The patient, methodical accountant was gone. In her place was an executioner. Falcone was untouchable in the shadows, but he craved the legitimacy of the light. His latest obsession was the South Side shipyard, a sprawling, derelict property he planned to turn into a billion-dollar casino and resort complex. The deal was nearly done, pending a final capital injection from a conservative Swiss bank, the kind of institution that valued reputation above all else. Ava, working from her makeshift command center, found the transaction schedule buried in a subfolder of the payroll server she'd breached. The final wire transfer of $100 million was scheduled for Thursday at 3:04 p.m. It was the keystone. Without it, the entire structure of the deal would collapse. She didn't have enough access to stop the transfer directly, but she didn't need to. Banks like this weren't afraid of hackers. They were terrified of regulators. For the next 48 hours, she barely slept. She meticulously crafted a series of anonymous tips, each one sent from a different encrypted email address and routed through a dozen countries. They weren't wild accusations. They were precise, surgical strikes filled with just enough truth to be undeniable. To the compliance department, one read, "I suggest you run a source of funds analysis on Falcone Holdings account, number 774B1. Specifically, look for incoming transfers from shell entity Azure Sky Investments in late April. You may find the origin of those funds problematic. She sent another tip to a different department, pointing them to a series of structured cash deposits, all just under the $10,000 reporting limit. She sent a third, hinting that a key executive in Falcone's company had recently been flagged by Interpol. Each tip was a single, venomous drop of poison into the bank's pristine bloodstream. The final piece of her plan was the riskiest. She created a tiny, dormant data worm and, using her limited access, attached it to the shipyard transaction file itself. The worm wouldn't steal or corrupt anything. It would simply add one invisible, unauthorized flag to the transaction, a marker used internally by federal agencies to denote assets linked to an active racketeering investigation. Thursday afternoon, Riccardo Falcone stood at a podium in the mayor's office, beaming for the cameras. The mayor was beside him, lauding him as a visionary, a savior of the city's economy. "With this partnership," Falcone boomed, his voice dripping with false humility, "we will transform the blight of the South Side into a beacon of prosperity for all." As he spoke, Ava sat in her apartment, watching the live news feed on her laptop. On another part of her screen, a tracking program monitored the Swiss bank's network. At 2:59 p.m., the transfer was initiated. At 3 p.m., her data worm activated. On the live feed, Falcone's phone, sitting on the podium, buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again, more insistently. Annoyed, he glanced at the screen. The camera zoomed in on his face, catching the exact moment his triumphant smile curdled. His eyes widened, his jaw went slack, and the color drained from his face, replaced by a blotchy, furious red. He fumbled for the phone, his hand shaking. The mayor leaned over. "Everything all right, Riccardo?" Falcone didn't answer. He stared at the text from his banker in Zurich. "Transfer blocked. Account frozen, pending internal money laundering and RICO inquiry. All funds are locked. Do not contact us." The deal was dead. $100 million, his key to legitimacy, had vanished into a regulatory black hole, and it had all happened live, on every news channel in the city. He looked up, his eyes scanning the crowd of reporters as if he could find the person responsible. His face was a mask of pure, impotent fury. In her apartment, Ava closed her laptop. She listened to the steady, rhythmic hum of her mother's new, hospital-grade oxygen machine, paid for with a small portion of her DOJ severance package. It was a sweet, satisfying sound. The first stone had been thrown. The giant was bleeding. The shipyard fiasco sent Falcone into a paranoid rage. He tore his organization apart, looking for the rat. Heads rolled. Men who had been with him for 20 years were dismissed with brutal finality. Ava knew the chaos was her cover, but it wouldn't last. Falcone was a wounded animal, and wounded animals were the most dangerous. She needed the final blow, the one he could never recover from. She needed his book. Every old-school gangster had one. A physical ledger where the real secrets were kept, the ones too dangerous to exist on any server. It was his insurance, his true source of power. According to the digital breadcrumbs she'd followed, he kept it in a Class 5 vault, hidden in his penthouse office at the top of Falcone Tower. Getting to it was impossible, which is why she had to try. She made a call she had hoped never to make. "Leo," she said when he answered. "I need a favor." Leo Chen was a legend in the DOJ's cyber forensics unit, a man who could walk through digital walls. Ava had once taken the fall for a risky, unauthorized operation he'd run, saving his career. He owed her. "Ava, what's wrong? You sound—" "I need the blueprints and security schematics for Falcone Tower," she said, cutting him off. "And I need a way to loop a 30-second security feed." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Ava, This isn't a good idea. This guy isn't some white-collar fraudster. He's the real deal. He tried to kill my mother, Leo. The schematics arrived in an encrypted file an hour later. Her plan was audacious. Falcone's company was catering an internal awards dinner on the 40th floor. Using a fake ID and a resume she'd doctored to show experience with high-end catering firms, she got a job as a server for the night. Dressed in the caterer's black and white uniform, she was just another anonymous face in the crowd. But beneath her clothes, taped to her skin, was her toolkit. A credit card-thin RFID spoofer, a miniature fiber-optic camera, and a set of custom-made tension wrenches. Her moment came during the main course. On her way back to the kitchen, she feigned a stumble, dropping her tray of dirty dishes near a service corridor. As staff rushed to help, she slipped unnoticed into the corridor. The first door was a keycard lock. She held the spoofer against it. It cycled through thousands of codes per second. After a tense 12 seconds, the light flashed green. She was in. The next 20 minutes were a blur of calculated risks. She navigated hallways guided by the blueprints on her phone, which Leo had helpfully annotated. Motion sensor here. Pressure plate under this rug. Camera C17 has a blind spot in the northeast corner. At the executive elevator, Leo worked his magic. Okay, the camera in the elevator is on a 30-second loop. You have 25 seconds from the moment the doors open to get to the penthouse floor and out of sight. Go. The elevator ride was the longest of her life. The doors opened onto a silent, marble-floored reception area. She darted out, pressing herself into an alcove just as the camera feed would have reset. She was on his floor. Falcone's office was protected by a biometric scanner. This was the one thing Leo couldn't hack remotely. But Ava had planned for it. From her research, she knew Falcone's office was cleaned every night at 10 p.m. by the same crew. The night before, she had, accidentally, bumped into the head cleaner in the lobby, an older man named Marco, apologizing as she helped him pick up his dropped supplies. In that brief contact, she had lifted a perfect fingerprint from his coffee thermos using a simple strip of forensic tape. Now, she applied the print, held in a thin layer of gelatin, to the scanner. It glowed green. The office was an ode to ego, a massive mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a portrait of Falcone himself, stylized to look like a Roman emperor. Behind the portrait was the vault. It was a monster of polished steel. The lock was a high-frequency digital keypad. She had one chance. She had noticed Falcone was a man of habit. His passwords always related to his personal history, his mother's birthday, the date he took over the family. But she also knew he was vain. She entered a date she had found in an old newspaper article, the day he made his first $1 million. The lock beeped, and with a heavy, satisfying thud, the tumblers disengaged. Inside, among stacks of cash and jewels, was a simple, leather-bound ledger. She opened it. It was all there. Names, dates, amounts, bribes to judges, payoffs to city inspectors, extortion schemes. It was a roadmap to the city's entire corrupt infrastructure. And then she saw it, a separate folder labeled Henderson. Inside was the deed to her building. The transfer price was listed as $1. Clipped to the deed was a letter from a pharmaceutical company, addressed to Mr. Henderson. It was a notice that the supply of the experimental drug his son needed to live would be indefinitely suspended due to distribution issues. The letter was dated the day before he signed over his life's work. Falcone hadn't just bought the building. He had found the man's greatest vulnerability, his child's life, and squeezed until he broke. Ava's hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a rage so cold and pure it felt like a religious experience. She pulled out a micro camera disguised as a pen and began to photograph every single page. The Falcone Foundation Charity Gala for Urban Renewal was the crown jewel of Riccardo's PR campaign, his final, desperate attempt to reclaim his legitimacy after the shipyard humiliation. It was his chance to stand before the city's elite and project an image of unbreakable power. The grand ballroom glittered with chandeliers and the clinking of 1,000 champagne flutes. The mayor, the police chief, judges and council members, all the beneficiaries of Falcone's largesse, all named in his ledger, applauded as he took the stage. He was a king surveying his court, a predator certain of his domain. Ava was there, a ghost in a black and white uniform, moving silently along the edge of the room. A simple earpiece connected her to Leo. Near the service entrance, she caught the eye of Marco, the head cleaner. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. He'd seen Falcone's cruelty for years, scrubbing away the filth the man left in his wake. Falcone had once fired Marco's nephew for looking at him the wrong way, a casual act of cruelty that had ruined the young man's life. Tonight, Marco was her hidden ally, ensuring a key fire exit would be propped open, and another, the one Falcone would run to, would be mysteriously jammed. He was guiding the rat into her trap. Falcone tapped the microphone, a self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face. The massive screens behind him showed a slideshow of his supposed good works, gleaming architectural models and smiling, staged photos of community leaders. "They say terrible things about me," Falcone began, his voice a low, theatrical rumble. The crowd hushed, leaning in. "They whisper in the shadows. They try to tear down what I have built. They call me a predator." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed through the ballroom. The front rows, filled with the city's powerful, laughed with him, a chorus of sycophants. "But look around you. I am a builder. I am a visionary. I look at a crumbling, forgotten property, like that old Henderson building downtown, a place full of pests. And I don't see decay. I see potential. I give it new life. I take what is weak and I make it strong. That is not predation." He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That is progress." He paused for the thunderous applause, basking in it, his chest swelling with pride. He was invincible. This was his city, these were his people, and he was their king. That was her cue. In the back of the ballroom, Ava touched her earpiece. "Now, Leo." The screens behind Falcone flickered. The image of a gleaming skyscraper vanished, replaced by a high-resolution photograph of a legal document. The deed to the Henderson property. The transfer price, $1, was circled in thick, blood-red ink. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Falcone faltered, squinting at the screen. He waved a hand dismissively, thinking it a technical glitch. "Apologies, ladies and gentlemen. A small—" The image changed again. This time it was the letter from the pharmaceutical company, threatening to cut off a sick child's life-saving medication. The letterhead was crisp, the threat unambiguous. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. The murmuring grew louder, more anxious. The mayor, who had been lifting a glass to his lips, froze, his hand trembling. The police chief's face went rigid, his eyes darting toward the exits. Then, the ledger pages began to appear, one after another, in a rapid, damning slideshow. Each slide was a death sentence to a career, a 7-figure payment to a shell company owned by the police chief's brother, a list of court cases with the word "fixed" written in Falcone's own hand next to the names of 2 judges sitting not 20 feet from the stage, a detailed accounting of kickbacks paid directly to the mayor's re-election campaign, complete with routing numbers and dates. Falcone stared in horror, his knuckles white on the podium. His carefully constructed world was being dismantled, pixel by pixel, in front of everyone he had bought and controlled. This wasn't a rival. This was an annihilation. Then, Leo patched in the audio. It was a secret recording Ava had made weeks ago, from a tiny microphone she'd hidden under Falcone's favorite booth at the diner. His voice, smug and cruel, filled the now silent ballroom. The old man didn't want to sell. Falcone's recorded voice bragged to his goons, crying about his family bakery. 70 years, blah, blah, blah. So I made a call. Suddenly, the medicine his kid needs to breathe is unavailable. Amazing how reasonable people become when their family is on the line. He signed it over for $1, a single dollar. Can you believe it? The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. The mayor and the police chief were already backing away from their tables, their faces ashen with terror. Reporters in the back were scrambling, their phones held up like weapons, broadcasting the raw feed to the world. Falcone, cornered, exposed, and utterly broken, did the only thing he knew how to do. He raged. He grabbed the microphone, his face contorted into a mask of pure, primal fury. He was weak, he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. That old man and his pathetic son. This city doesn't reward weakness. It rewards strength. I took what I wanted because I was strong enough to take it. That's the only law that matters. My law. He had convicted himself with his own words, on his own stage. As chaos erupted, he shoved the podium aside and lunged for a service exit behind the stage curtain. He threw the door open and ran down a short hallway, expecting an alleyway to freedom. He slammed into the next door. It was locked, jammed. He turned, panicked, and saw another hallway. He sprinted down it, his polished shoes slipping on the linoleum. He burst through the final door and found himself in a quiet, sterile service corridor. It was empty, except for her. Ava stood there, a tray of empty glasses in her hand, blocking his path. She was calm, her face a placid lake in his hurricane of panic. "Get out of my way, you stupid girl!" he snarled, not even recognizing her in his frenzy. She didn't move. She simply looked him in the eye, her gaze level and cold. "You look tired, Mr. Falcone," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron. "Tough life." The blood drained from his face. The caterer's uniform, the flat, unimpressed tone. It all clicked into place. "You," he breathed, the word a death rattle. "The waitress." "I told you," she said, setting the tray down with a soft clink that echoed in the corridor. "Not anymore." "How?" he demanded, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Who are you?" "You should have tipped better," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "You know, I chose that diner for a reason. I knew it was your spot, your little kingdom where you felt safe enough to be your ugliest self. You thought you were choosing the booth. I was choosing the battlefield." He stared at her, his mind reeling. You planned this? From the beginning?" "Every second of it," she confirmed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You thought you were humiliating me. You were giving me weapons. You knocked over the coffee to burn my hand, to show your power. But while you were admiring your work, I was getting a perfect 5-second look at the CVV number on the back of your credit card. You thought you were so clever." His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "And the dollar," she continued, taking a step closer as he instinctively backed away. "You ground it into the floor to show me my place. But I wasn't looking at the money. I was studying the unique scuff mark on your left shoe. A custom job. The same scuff mark I found in the dust on the basement floor the night my mother's oxygen was cut off. You were there yourself, weren't you? You had to watch. You had to be sure. That was your signature, Ricardo. Not the one you scribble on credit card slips. The one you leave in the dirt. His eyes widened in pure terror. He was caught, not just by evidence, but by her, personally. "The locket," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at her neck. "You said it was your father's." "It is," she replied, her voice turning to ice. "He was a city building inspector, an honest one. He refused to sign off on your first major construction project because you were using substandard materials. He wouldn't take your bribes. A week later, he was killed in a hit and run. The driver was never found, but the car was traced to a shell company. One of your shell companies. Azure Sky Investments." The name hung in the air between them, the same shell company she had anonymously tipped off the Swiss bank about. It was all connected. Everything. "I'll kill you," he hissed, his bravado a pathetic, crumbling facade. "I'll destroy you. I'll ruin everyone you've ever met." "You already tried," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion, except a cold, hard finality. "You tried to take my mother's life. You took Mr. Henderson's hope. You took everything from people who had nothing. All for what? For a name on a building?" She reached up and touched the small silver locket. "This was my father's. You called it a piece of junk. It's a reminder of what's actually valuable. Legacy. Family. Honor. Things you can't buy and things you'll never understand." Just then, the service door burst open. 2 federal agents, guns drawn, stormed into the hallway. They saw Falcone, a cornered animal, and Ava, the calm eye of the storm. Falcone let out a final, guttural roar of defiance and lunged, not at the agents, but at her. He never made it. The agents tackled him, slamming him against the wall. As they wrenched his arms behind his back and the cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists, his wild, hate-filled eyes were locked on Ava. His empire was gone. His allies were turning on him. His life was over. And it was all because of a waitress he had tried to humiliate for $1. The collapse was total. The gala became a federal crime scene. Falcone was arrested, his bellows of rage echoing through the gilded ballroom as he was dragged past the stunned faces of his former allies. The mayor, the police chief, and 6 other city officials were taken into custody before the night was over. Falcone's empire, built on fear, crumbled in a single evening. With his assets frozen under the RICO Act, his network of shell companies was seized. Acting on behalf of the tenants and other victims, a pro bono legal team Ava had assembled filed a massive class action lawsuit. They didn't just want compensation, they wanted the source of his power. Citing a little-known clause in the asset forfeiture laws, they laid claim to his primary holding, Falcone Tower. 6 months later, Ava stood on the marble steps, watching the last letter of his name being removed. The air was crisp and clean. Mr. Henderson stood beside her, his old frail body no longer trembling, his eyes clear and full of a light she hadn't seen before. His son's experimental medication had been restored the day after the gala, the pharmaceutical company suddenly eager to avoid federal scrutiny. "I never thought I'd see this day," he whispered, watching as the first letter of the new sign was hoisted into place. Whew. When the new name was fully revealed, bolted to the stone where Falcone's had once been, the Henderson Foundation for Community Housing. Ava handed the old man a ceremonial wrench. With a shaky but firm hand, he tightened the final bolt himself. The tower, once a monument to one man's greed, would now be a sanctuary. Its luxury condos would become affordable homes for the families he had displaced. The penthouse office would become a free legal aid and community center. Falcone, his face a ruin of hatred, was led past them toward an armored vehicle that would take him to a supermax prison. His eyes locked on Ava one last time. "You think you've won?" he snarled, his voice a raw wound. "You're still nothing. A waitress." Ava simply held his gaze, her expression unreadable. She walked down the steps until she was standing directly in front of him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single, crisp dollar bill. She didn't say a word. She just held it up between them, then tucked it neatly into the breast pocket of his prison jumpsuit. "For the entertainment," she said softly. He stared at the dollar, then at her, his face contorting in a final, silent scream of impotent rage as the agents pushed him into the van. The door slammed shut, sealing him in darkness. Ava turned her back on him, a final, complete dismissal. Taking Mr. Henderson's arm, she looked up at the new name shining in the morning sun. Her mother, breathing easy in their new, secure apartment on the 10th floor, was safe. Her neighbors were safe. Justice, for once, had been served. The fight was over. She wasn't just going home. She was building a new one for everyone he had ever wronged.